Hi, Bernie Maloney, Powered by Teams, here with another episode of Agile 5x5, a series of short videos, typically 5 to 10 minutes, where we cover Agile topics. Now, today is going to be a special edition. It's going to be a little bit longer where I cover product backlogs. If you want to follow along, there's going to be a link in the comments here where you can download a PDF and follow along as I take you through a bunch of concepts with product backlogs. Now, that PDF will look a little bit like this. And product backlogs, something to know, is they're the single source of truth for what your Scrum team is going to work on. If things are not in your product backlog, your team shouldn't be working on them. Now, every product backlog should have a product goal. That's the commitment for the artifact that is the product backlog. The product goal is a medium to long-term tangible future state of the product. It gives your team a target to plan against. The product goal also serves as an organizing principle for your product backlog. If things don't fit with the product goal, they don't belong in the product backlog, and if they're not in the product backlog, your team shouldn't be working on them. Now, product backlogs, they will contain features, but they'll also contain fixes and bugs. See, it's not just about the bright, shiny stuff that people are asking for. It's really about anything that needs to go into the product, and that can be fixes and bugs as well. You'll probably also have some technical debt in your product. Technical debt creeps in when you take shortcuts and you compromise your quality. So an example of technical debt is, you know how a clean house is easier to keep clean than a dirty house. Well, that dirty house, that's an example of technical debt. It may have crept up over time and it makes it harder to keep things up to date. So technical debt can come in inadvertently where you didn't intend it to, like misspellings in a document. Or it can be deliberate, where you recognize you got to take a shortcut on your quality to get something out. When you encounter technical debt, it's a really good practice to capture that technical debt as a new product backlog item and order it relative to the rest of the stuff in your product backlog. There might be things that you choose to defer for a time, but eventually it could come up and claim an awful lot of your bandwidth, like if you don't keep your house clean. Now, you may frame up the stuff that you've got in your product backlog in terms of user stories, which is a really handy technique in Agile. I'm not going to cover that here in this video, but one thing I'd like you to do is make a clear distinction in your own head between the term stories with a lowercase s and the term user stories with an uppercase U and an uppercase S. Stories is a convenient label applied to product backlog items because it's fewer syllables to say. And calling them that comes from the practice of user stories. What user stories are intended to do is to get clear shared understanding between the people wanting the work done and the people doing the work by telling a short story of the user and their problem to solve. Now, there's a format for that makes it easy to tell that story. You don't have to frame everything in your product backlog up in a user story format if it's already clear to the people wanting the work done and the people doing the work. Again, I can cover that in another video if you're interested. Product backlogs, they're really just containers for all the ideas about stuff that you want to go in to improve the product. Now, they are always linear, but they have multiple dimensions. It's kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa that looks different from the different angles that you're at. The most common dimension that you're going to hear about is often called priority, but it should really be called order. See, priority only talks about urgency, but ordering talks about things like sequencing and dependency. You'll hear things talked about as being high in a product backlog or low in a product backlog. That's an idea of order. Another dimension as you walk around another side of the tower is time. Stuff that's higher in the product backlog, you're going to be working on sooner. Stuff that's lower in the product backlog, you're going to be working on later. Another dimension is size. Stuff you're going to be working on sooner, you're going to have small. Stuff you're going to be working on later can be big. Now, how small is small enough is often a question. Here's a recommendation. This is really just my opinion. When stuff is near the top of the product backlog, and I consider that to be about 1 to 3 sprints worth of stuff, a good heuristic is to try to get that stuff small enough that you can finish it, and that means get it to done, whatever your definition of done is, in 1 quarter sprint or less. The reason I say that is even if you're running a 1-month sprint, if you can get to done inside of 1 week, you can get some feedback and maybe make some course adjustments before the sprint is over. Another reason is it makes it a little simpler to do some estimation because you can go, hey, what can we do that we can fit into 1 sprint? Okay, what could we do that's just a slice of that value or maybe a lower fidelity version of that that's in a half sprint? Oh, what about a quarter sprint? So you can do some successive approximation to try to get some value out in the sprint even before the end of the sprint and to get some of that feedback about what the most valuable stuff is. Okay, now every product backlog item is going to have a few attributes. Description and order you got to have, or you just don't have a product backlog. Lots of organizations struggle with the concept of estimate or size, but there's really, in my mind, a fourth attribute in a product backlog item. It was covered in the 2017 guide. They took it out in 2020. I honestly think that was a mistake. So a lot of organizations, they get description and order, they struggle with estimate or size, but that fourth attribute, okay, is value. And you can remember this as description, order, value, and estimate. Have you ever gotten to the end of the sprint and the most important thing wasn't completed? Somebody brought that to your team's attention and they said, oh my gosh, if we had only known that, we would have been sure to get that done. That probably happened because you didn't put value on as a distinct attribute from effort. When you do, even if it's t-shirt sizes for value, your team is very naturally, okay, going to look at value and effort, kind of bang for the buck. And oh, now we understand why it's ordered the way it is. And you'll have much better refinement sessions. What a lot of organizations do, they get description and order. They struggle with estimate or size, so they'll blend effort, okay, value, they'll blend with priority. Oh my gosh, this is really urgent stuff. And they'll blend it with order, or they'll blend it with size. Oh my gosh, we need more velocity out of the team. Frankly, that's just not logical, because if you ask for more velocity out of a team, you'll get it. They'll just inflate their estimates. You won't get any more value. That's why you want to put value on as a distinct attribute from effort. It can even be t-shirt sizes. That kind of helps it. Now, something that helps your description is to break that down a little bit. As product owners, you really want to focus on outcomes, not on outputs. You want to focus on the deliverables to your customer. You want to focus on what they want, not how to fulfill it. So really focus on that value to your customers. Let your teams figure out how to build things. This is one of the hardest things I find for product owners that are new, is to switch from thinking like a producer of the work to thinking like a consumer of the work. You really want to put yourself in your customer's shoes. Another thing that helps in your description is to talk about the user or the persona, who's going to use this. This what and this who starts to build some empathy with your team about what they're building, so they understand better the situation that they're facing or that their customer is facing, so that they can deliver higher quality stuff that better fits their needs. Another aspect is acceptance criteria. Now, a lot of people get acceptance criteria confused a little bit with definition of done, so I want to unpack that here for you. On this hand, I'm going to talk about definition of done. On this hand, I'm going to talk about acceptance criteria. Okay, definition of done applies to the whole increment. What it says in the Scrum Guide is when a product backlog item meets the definition of done, a new increment is born. Now, an increment can be made from one or more product backlog items, and because that definition of done applies to the whole increment, that implies that the definition of done is durable from product backlog item to product backlog item, from increment to increment, from sprint to sprint. Okay, so definition of done applies to the whole increment. It's an intrinsic quality standard. It's more internal facing into the way that you work. And it's essentially, hey, have we built this in such a way that we could put it into production? Is it usable? Is it valuable? You can think of it as, did we build the product right? Okay, acceptance criteria, on the other hand, acceptance criteria can change from item to item in your product backlog. So it's more tied to the individual item in your product backlog versus the definition of done, which is tied to the increment. Acceptance criteria are more extrinsic quality standards. They're more customer facing. It's essentially, did we build the right product? Let me give you an example of a definition of done and acceptance criteria. Think of a production run of cars. That's kind of like a product backlog. Here, each item in the product backlog delivers value in and of itself. Each car is valuable. Okay, for every car that we produce, no matter what the other characteristics of it are, our definition of done is a crash test. Okay, so we're probably not going to crash every single car. Okay, it's intrinsic quality. And it's essentially, have we built the car in such a way that it will pass a crash test if it crashes? We're just going to build it so that it meets that quality standard. It ties to the increment, okay, versus the individual product backlog item. Versus an acceptance criteria, which can vary from item to item in that product backlog and is more extrinsic in nature. Here's an example. Instead of a crash test, it's did we get the perfect shade of blue for Bernie? Did we build the right product for Bernie? We're probably not going to paint every car blue unless it's matching my sweater and I'm the only one who's buying them. So that's kind of the difference between a definition of done and acceptance criteria. So having an individual acceptance criteria on your product backlog items will help your teams better deliver what your customers expect, as will understanding the value to those customers. Now, something to know is your product backlog items, they're going to be dynamic and emergent. They might change over time. So you don't have to know everything in your product backlog to start. You're going to find that stuff is going to move around. Okay, you're going to find new stuff that appears. You're going to find old stuff that disappears and is no longer valuable. All of that is entirely normal. Now, the bubbles in the lower right-hand corner of this diagram, they kind of describe the way to frame up both your product backlog items and the teams that are working on them. Lots of organizations tend to think of their products in terms of layers, and that's what these bubbles represent. For a lot of software products, a database, a business logic, a UI layer are pretty common. For some of the hardware products that some of my clients work on, hardware products also think of that same way in layers of hardware, firmware, and software. Hardware is like the physical stuff. Firmware are the chips that have some software on them that you can plug in. So they got some both software and some physical dimensionality to them. And then software is the stuff that runs on the hardware and gives us all the operation of the stuff. So a lot of organizations tend to think of their products in layers, and they tend to frame up working groups along these layers. These are often known as component teams. And when a requirement comes in, then there's a bunch of handoffs and coordination. And when something finally pops out, might have taken a long time, or the customer says something like, you know, that's exactly what I asked for, but what I really needed was. You ever hear that? Yeah. Now, here's what a lot of folks do when that happens. They go, I know, we're going to do this Agile thing. And instead of handing things to teams in serials with handoffs, we're going to hand those same requirements to the teams in parallel. Nice idea. Here's the challenge. When you've got component teams, circle, triangle, square, they tend to think about things only in their own way. And then you get to the end of a sprint and circle, triangle, square. Now you've got to integrate things. Write this down. Anytime you defer integration, testing, or acceptance, you are accruing risk. Okay, so that way might work, might not. Here's a better way. What you want to do is you want to take those requirements and you want to break them into thin vertical slices of value. Okay, so that, and you also want to frame your teams so that they've got cross-functional skills to be able to deliver those slices of value. This is one of the ways that Scrum mitigates risk, because if one team has some problems and isn't able to get out that slice, hey, maybe some of the other teams did, and you get some value instead of having to have handoffs in between the layers. So this gives you a pretty quick overview of a bunch of concepts in the product backlog. If you found this video useful, please remember to like, subscribe, and share to this channel. Really, sharing this out with your friends is a great way to get the word out about this stuff. If I can be of service to y'all at some point in the future, you can contact me through that QR code or poweredbyteams.com/contact. Until the next video, be well, stay vibrant, and thank you.